In a world plagued by confusion and hopelessness, where chaos and uncertainty are reflected in every headline, scientists have issued a chilling warning: the Doomsday Clock. According to experts, in 2025 we will be just 89 seconds from midnight, the closest we have ever been to catastrophe. This critical moment is a reflection of a constantly increasing global tension, marked by armed conflicts, climate crisis, the inexorable advance of artificial intelligence, and the nuclear threat. All of this invites us to ask ourselves, is this perhaps an unavoidable omen of the end of times that we cannot yet understand? Are we on the brink of an abyss with no return? Or is there something beyond the explanations of science? Could it be that God is manifesting himself through these warning messages? In this shocking documentary, we will explore the enigma of the Doomsday Clock, analyzing its disturbing implications and the warnings of experts. At the same time, we will immerse ourselves in the Bible to discover God's authentic prophetic clock, whose signs foreshadow the relentless advance toward the fulfillment of prophecy. Before we move on, share your opinion with us. With everything that's happening in the world, do you think we're on the verge of the end of time? Let us know what you think. Let's get started. Since time immemorial, mankind has felt a deep concern for the future. Ancient civilizations not only observed natural cycles, but also sought to understand the fate of their kingdoms, their people, and the entire world. Through oracles, astrology, prophecies, and divine signs, they tried to decipher what was to come. The Babylonians were pioneers in the study of the sky and believed that the movements of the stars influenced the destiny of kingdoms and men. They developed one of the first astrological systems, where each celestial event, such as an eclipse or the position of the planets, was interpreted as a divine message. Kings consulted their priest astrologers before making decisions, and many prophecies were linked to these cosmic events. For the Egyptians, the future depended on maintaining Ma'at, the principle of order and justice that sustained the universe. If this balance was broken, chaos and destruction would follow. The pharaohs were seen as guarantors of La'at, and if their government was weak or corrupt, it was believed that the end was near. Furthermore, the Egyptians had prophetic texts, such as the prophecies of Nefertiti, which spoke of times of crisis and redemption. The Mayans possessed advanced astronomical and mathematical knowledge, which allowed them to develop a precise calendar based on time cycles. They did not see the future as a straight line, but rather as a series of repeating cycles. For them, each era had a beginning and an end, and they believed that the gods intervened in these processes. Their famous long count calendar was wrongly interpreted as a prophecy of the end of the world in 2012, when in fact it indicated the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. The ancient Greeks consulted oracles for answers about the future. The Oracle of Delphi at the Temple of Apollo was the most famous, and its ambiguous answers influenced political and military decisions. They believed that the gods communicated their will through signs and omens, and that the destiny of men was predestined, although they could try to change it. Dear listeners, as we can see throughout history, humanity has sought ways to predict the future, whether through the stars, divine prophecies, or signs of nature. But in the modern era, predicting the fate of the world has passed from the hands of priests and prophets to scientists and experts. Although unlike other cultures, the vision of the future in the Hebrew and Christian tradition does not depend on the stars or natural cycles, but on direct revelations from God to his prophets. The Bible is full of prophecies about the fate of the world, such as Daniel's visions, which foretold the fall and rise of empires, or the Apocalypse of John, which describes the events leading up to Christ's return. For the Hebrews and Christians, the future was in God's hands and its fulfillment was inevitable. Now, the Doomsday Clock was created in 1947 by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, an organization founded in 1945 by physicists at the University of Chicago, including Albert Einstein and J. Robert Oppenheimer, with the purpose of alerting the world about the dangers of nuclear weapons and other existential threats to humanity. The idea for the watch arose after the devastating atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, which marked the beginning of a new era in war and global geopolitics. With the end of the Second World War, the world was divided into two large blocks, the capitalist one led by the United States and the communist one led by the Soviet Union. This ideological and military confrontation gave rise to the Cold War, an era characterized by the arms race and the fear of a large-scale nuclear war. In this context, scientists working on the Manhattan Project responsible for developing the first atomic bombs realized the serious implications of their creation. Fearing a future of global destruction, they decided to establish a symbol that could raise awareness among the population and world leaders about the impending threat, the Doomsday Clock. Scientists designed this clock as a visual symbol to illustrate how close humanity was to catastrophic self-destruction. Instead of actual hours, the clock measures time in minutes and seconds before midnight, where midnight represents the point of an irreversible crisis. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists periodically adjusts the clock based on global events that may increase or decrease the risk of catastrophe. The concept is metaphorical. Midnight represents the moment when humanity would collapse due to a man-made catastrophe, be it nuclear war, climate change, or the misuse of emerging technologies. Since its creation, the clock's time has changed more than 25 times, reflecting evolving global threats. When the clock was first introduced in 1947, it was set at 7 minutes to midnight. Since then, it has been adjusted multiple times, depending on geopolitical conditions, and over time, it has been expanded to reflect other global threats, such as international conflicts and nuclear weapons, climate change and ecological disasters, biotechnology and pandemics, and artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. Since 1947, the Doomsday Clock has changed more than 25 times, reflecting the evolution of global threats perceived by the scientific community. Let's look at the evolution of the clock below. In 1947, the clock was first set to 7 minutes to midnight, reflecting the growing global tension following World War II and the start of the Cold War. That year marked the beginning of an era dominated by confrontation between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. As mutual distrust grew, so did the arms race. Both nations possessed nuclear technology, and the possibility of a devastating conflict seemed more real than ever. Furthermore, the world was still reeling from the devastation of World War II. The creation of the UN was intended to prevent further global conflicts, but the political landscape was rapidly becoming polarized. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan outlined the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, laying the groundwork for decades of geopolitical rivalry. But why was the clock set to 7 minutes? The number 7 symbolized the latent danger of an imminent nuclear conflict. Although there was no immediate threat, scientists felt it necessary to warn of the growing risk of nuclear war if the world did not take steps to de-escalate the situation. Its first configuration in 1947 set a precedent. Humanity was dangerously close to destruction, and time was running out to prevent it. In 1953, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the Doomsday Clock forward to 2 minutes to midnight, the closest position to catastrophe since its creation in the year mentioned above. This adjustment reflected the enormous danger posed by the intensification of the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, specifically with the development and testing of the hydrogen bomb H-bomb, a weapon much more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The Cold War was at its height. 2 years earlier, in 1951, the Korean War had escalated, consolidating the division of the world into two irreconcilable blocs: the capitalist bloc led by the United States and the communist bloc led by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Military competition between the two superpowers accelerated, and the development of nuclear weapons became a strategic priority. On November 1, 1952, the United States detonated the first hydrogen bomb, dubbed Ivy Mike, at Inuitak Atoll in the Marshall Islands. It was the first successful test of a thermonuclear bomb, with a destructive power 500 times greater than the Nagasaki bomb. Then, on August 12, 1953, The Soviet Union responded quickly with its own test of a hydrogen bomb, designated RDS-6S, carried out in Semipalatinsk, present-day Kazakhstan. Unlike the American bomb, the Soviet one was a smaller, more practical version, posing a more immediate threat to the West. The ability of both countries to build and deploy weapons of mass destruction on a large scale led the bulletin's scientists to move the clock back to 2 minutes to midnight, warning that the world has never been so close to total annihilation. The 2 minutes symbolized extreme urgency. The world was on the brink of a devastating nuclear conflict. Never before in human history had there been such a high risk of total war with catastrophic consequences for civilization. The Cold War was becoming a war of deterrence, with the concept of mutual assured destruction, MAD. Both powers understood that a direct confrontation would mean the end of civilization, which led to a tense peace based on the threat of mutual extermination. Fear of a global nuclear war grew. Although there was no direct conflict, the world lived under the shadow of fear, with nuclear attack drills in schools and the proliferation of nuclear fallout shelters in several nations. The 1953 crisis marked a critical point in the history of the Doomsday Clock. Although there were moments of détente in the following years, such as the signing of some arms control agreements, the clock never turned back far enough to eliminate the nuclear threat. This adjustment in 1953 made it clear that the arms race endangered not only the superpowers, but all of humanity. It was a reminder that even if the bombs had not yet been dropped, the mere existence of such weapons kept the world in a state of permanent danger. In 1991, the Doomsday Clock was moved to 17 minutes to midnight, the furthest position from catastrophe in its entire history. This adjustment reflected the end of the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and significant progress toward nuclear disarmament between the United States and Russia. The 1980s were marked by a deep economic and political crisis in the Soviet Union. For years, the USSR had tried to compete with the United States in the arms race, space exploration, and global influence, but its centralized economic model became unsustainable. Mikhail Gorbachev, Soviet leader since 1985, implemented reforms such as perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, political openness, to save the country. However, these measures weakened the central control of the state, causing a progressive collapse of the communist system. In 1989 and 1991, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the collapse of the communist bloc in Eastern Europe. Communist regimes in countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania fell in quick succession. December 1991, the USSR officially dissolved, fragmenting into 15 independent republics. Russia, under the leadership of Boris Yeltsin, emerged as the principal heir to the Soviet nuclear arsenal. The end of the Cold War brought with it major nuclear arms reduction treaties between the United States and Russia, which helped push back the Doomsday Clock. The agreement between the United States and the newly created Russian Federation to reduce 1/3 of their strategic nuclear arsenals. The INF Treaty, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in 1987, it eliminated short and medium-range nuclear missiles in Europe, reducing the threat of nuclear war on the continent. After the dissolution of the USSR, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus inherited Soviet nuclear weapons. However, in the following years, they agreed to either hand them over to Russia or dismantle them, avoiding the risk of proliferation. These agreements marked a new era of international cooperation, reducing geopolitical tension and removing the threat of global nuclear war. Now, the significance of 17 minutes to midnight. The greatest distance from midnight in the history of the clock indicated that the world was safer than it had ever been since the creation of the Doomsday Clock in 1947. Fear of a nuclear confrontation has diminished considerably as the major superpowers have reduced their arsenals and established arms control mechanisms. The world entered an era of optimism and relative stability, with hopes that the nuclear threat would continue to decline in the decades to come. Did the peace last? Despite the optimism of 1991, the following years showed that nuclear peace was not guaranteed. In the 2000s, tensions between the United States and Russia resurfaced, and nuclear disarmament slowed down. New nuclear powers emerge, such as India, Pakistan, and North Korea. Terrorism and weapons of mass destruction become new global threats. Over time, the clock moved closer to midnight again, reflecting the new challenges and conflicts of the 21st century. However, 1991 remains the most hopeful moment in the history of the Doomsday Clock, when the world was furthest from the danger of self-destruction. Now, in 2018, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists adjusted the Doomsday Clock to 2 minutes to midnight, matching the danger level reached in 1953, when the United States and the Soviet Union detonated their first hydrogen bombs. This alarming setback was due to rising nuclear tensions, failed international diplomacy, and the climate crisis, leading experts to warn that the world was dangerously close to a global catastrophe. One of the main reasons for the adjustment was the growing possibility of a nuclear conflict. During 2017 and 2018, several countries stepped up their threats and testing of nuclear weapons, which increased global uncertainty. North Korea has conducted multiple tests of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and in 2017 carried out its most powerful nuclear test to date, claiming to have developed a hydrogen bomb small enough to be mounted on a missile. This sparked fears of a possible nuclear conflict, especially given the aggressive rhetoric between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and then US President Donald Trump. The Trump administration announced in 2018 its intention to withdraw from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, a key agreement with Russia that had significantly reduced medium-range nuclear missiles in Europe since 1987. The possible resumption of an arms race between the United States and Russia was seen as a major risk to global stability. Now, nuclear weapons modernization. Both the United States and Russia began developing new advanced nuclear weapons, including hypersonic missiles and warheads with greater destructive capacity, raising the possibility of a catastrophic error or accidental conflict. Another key factor that pushed the clock to 2 minutes to midnight was the growing threat of climate change, which had become a global problem with potentially devastating consequences. More intense hurricanes, out-of-control wildfires, and record heat waves occurred in different parts of the world, showing that climate change was accelerating faster than expected. In 2017, the United States announced its withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, an international pact designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Since the United States was one of the largest emitters of CO2, its withdrawal was seen as a serious setback in the fight against global warming. Governments in many nations continued to prioritize economic growth over environmental sustainability, and efforts to reduce emissions remained insufficient to prevent a catastrophic rise in global temperatures. Another factor, technological threats and lack of diplomacy. The rise of fake news, election manipulation, and cyber attacks by powers such as Russia and China increased political instability. Distrust in democracy grew and political polarization intensified, making international cooperation difficult. We cannot ignore the progress in artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons. The development of autonomous weapons systems without human oversight raised new concerns about the use of artificial intelligence in warfare, increasing the risk of accidental military conflict. Finally, failure in international diplomacy. The deterioration of relations between the great powers, coupled with the weakening of international institutions such as the UN, reduced the possibilities of resolving conflicts through dialogue. The significance of 2 minutes to midnight, a dire warning. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists declared that the world was in a situation as dangerous as in 1953, when the threat of nuclear war was imminent. Not just nuclear risk, but multiple simultaneous threats. In 2018, the combination of climate crisis, political instability, dangerous technological advances, and misinformation made global risk even more complex and difficult to manage. World on the brink of collapse. Scientists warned that without concrete action to reduce nuclear weapons and curb climate change, humanity was rapidly heading towards a point of no return. What happened next? Despite some attempts at diplomacy, such as talks between the United States and North Korea, the world continued to face multiple crises. In 2020, the clock moved even closer, reaching 100 seconds to midnight, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, weakening arms control agreements, and the persistent climate crisis. Now, on January 24, 2023, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the Doomsday Clock to 90 seconds to midnight, the closest position to global catastrophe in the clock's history. This decision reflected the deterioration of global security, driven primarily by the war in Ukraine and the nuclear risk, conflicts in the Middle East, and global instability. Advances in artificial intelligence and the lack of regulation, climate change and government inaction, disinformation, and the collapse of international diplomacy. These interconnected factors led scientists and global security experts to warn that humanity was at its most dangerous moment since the invention of nuclear weapons. The conflict began on February 24, 2022, when Russia launched a large-scale invasion of Ukraine. This attack marked the first conventional war in Europe since World War II and revived geopolitical tensions that many considered to be over. Since the start of the war, Russian President Vladimir Putin has made multiple statements suggesting that he might use tactical nuclear weapons if Russia were threatened. In September 2022, Putin announced a partial mobilization and said Russia would use all available means to defend its territory, which was interpreted as a nuclear warning. During the war, Russia occupied the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe, raising concerns about a possible radioactive disaster. Bombings and clashes near the plant increased fears of an accidental nuclear catastrophe. In February 2023, Russia suspended its participation in the New START Treaty, the last major nuclear arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. Without this treaty, both powers were left without limits on the number of strategic nuclear weapons they could deploy, increasing the risk of a new arms race. Following the war, many countries increased their defense budgets. Germany, Japan, and other Western countries announced historic investments in arms. NATO expanded its influence with the accession of Finland and Sweden, which intensified rivalry with Russia. Another factor, conflicts in the Middle East and global instability. In 2023, tensions between Israel and Palestine reached critical levels, with constant clashes in Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. Extremist groups stepped up their attacks, and the Israeli military response escalated the conflict, causing hundreds of deaths. Iran continued to develop its nuclear program and strengthen allied groups such as Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen, creating further instability in the region. Drone and missile attacks between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis have raised the prospects of a larger war. Since the U.S. withdrawal in 2021, Afghanistan has fallen into the hands of the Taliban, and in 2023, the country faced a surge in activity from terrorist groups such as the Islamic State Khorasan, ISIS-K. Another factor, the United States and China, rivalry in the Pacific. China has increased its pressure on Taiwan, holding military exercises near the island and raising concerns about a possible invasion. The United States has strengthened alliances in Asia, including agreements with Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, which has increased tensions in the region. Another factor, advances in artificial intelligence and the lack of regulation, is accelerating the development of AI. In 2023, tools like ChatGPT-4, Midjourney, and other advanced AIs have demonstrated unprecedented capabilities to automate tasks, generate content, and make decisions in critical sectors. Experts have warned that AI could be used to create deepfakes, manipulate elections, and design autonomous weapons without human control. Several countries have begun developing military robots equipped with AI, raising concerns about the future of warfare. AI also threatened millions of jobs, as sectors such as programming, education, and the arts were impacted by automation. The lack of regulation increased fears of uncontrolled development of these technologies. Finally, climate change, an existential threat. Extreme weather events. In 2023, the year was marked by a series of unprecedented natural disasters, including record heat waves in Europe and North America, devastating floods in Pakistan and China, massive wildfires in Canada and Australia. Despite multiple scientific warnings, many countries failed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Dependence on fossil fuels remained high, and the transition to clean energy progressed slowly. Global temperatures continued to rise, accelerating ice melting in Greenland and Antarctica. Coastal cities such as New York, Shanghai, and Miami faced increased flood risks. Now, on January 28, 2025, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists set the Doomsday Clock to 89 seconds to midnight, marking the closest position to a global catastrophe in the history of this indicator. This adjustment reflects an increase in international tensions and multiple threats that put the survival of humanity at risk. Let's look at key factors of adjustment in 2025. Geopolitical conflicts and nuclear risk. War in Ukraine. The conflict, which entered its third year in 2025, has heightened tensions between nuclear powers, raising the risk of an escalation that could lead to the use of nuclear weapons. Conflicts in the Middle East. The region has seen an escalation of violence, with clashes that could further destabilize the area and have global repercussions. Increased nuclear arsenals. Countries with nuclear capabilities have increased their arsenals and invested in developing new weapons, raising the threat of nuclear conflict. Another factor, climate change and environmental disasters. Extreme weather events. The year 2024 witnessed severe weather events, such as unprecedented heat waves, devastating wildfires, and catastrophic floods, highlighting the accelerated effects of climate change. Another factor, political inaction. Despite clear danger signals, world leaders have not implemented effective measures to mitigate climate change, which worsens the situation. Of course, technological advances and disinformation. Artificial intelligence. The rapid development and deployment of AI systems in critical areas, such as defense and bioengineering, without adequate regulation, poses significant risks to global security. Another factor, disinformation. The spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories has undermined public trust and exacerbated social divisions, making it difficult to respond collectively to crises. Now, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists emphasizes the urgent need for world leaders to take decisive action to address these interrelated threats. International cooperation, the implementation of effective policies, and a commitment to peace and sustainability are essential to bring the world back from the brink of catastrophe. The Doomsday Clock serves as a symbolic reminder of humanity's proximity to self-inflicted dangers. The current position of 89 seconds to midnight highlights the urgency of collective action to ensure a safe and sustainable future. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists annually updates the position of the clock based on a multidisciplinary analysis of the greatest dangers to humanity. Some of the most prominent experts have issued worrying warnings. Now, unlike the Doomsday Clock, which is based on human assessment of dangers, God has set up his own prophetic clock in the Bible, which not only warns us of the future, but gives us certainty of its fulfillment. The Bible describes prophetic events that point to the advancing time toward the second coming of Christ and the end of the present age. Some of these signs include: in first place, increasing wars and conflicts. The constant global tensions, such as the war in Ukraine and the conflicts in the Middle East, reflect this prophecy. Let's read Matthew chapter 24, verse 6 and 7. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. In second place, Israel, God's prophetic clock. Jesus compared the end of time to the blossoming of the fig tree, a symbol of Israel. The restoration of Israel in 1948 is one of the clearest signs that prophetic time has entered its final phase. Let's read Matthew chapter 24, verse 32. Learn a parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. The return of Jews to their land. In the 20th century, Jews returned to their land after nearly 2,000 years of diaspora. Conflicts around Jerusalem. Jerusalem has become the center of global tension. Preparations for the Third Temple. Religious sectors in Israel are already working on the elements for the reconstruction of the temple. Israel is God's clock, because all of biblical prophecy revolves around this nation. Anyone who wants to understand prophetic timing must look at what is happening with Israel. And third place, moral decay. The moral decay of recent times is a phenomenon that many consider a worrying sign of the collapse of society. The loss of fundamental values, the increase in corruption, the degradation of the family, and contempt for the truth are symptoms of a humanity that seems to be moving further and further away from ethical and spiritual principles. The Bible warns about these difficult times in passages such as 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, which describes a generation characterized by excessive self-love, greed, arrogance, disobedience, and a lack of natural affection. Today we see how these characteristics manifest themselves in culture, politics, and everyday life, the relativization of good and evil, the normalization of sin, and the rejection of all forms of moral authority. As society sinks into this spiritual crisis, many are wondering if we are living in the days leading up to a divine judgment. The growing immorality, ideological confusion, and aggression against everything that represents God's truth are signs that invite us to seriously reflect. Are we witnessing the prelude to the fulfillment of biblical prophecies? The Doomsday Clock is therefore a scientific tool that warns of global dangers, but it cannot predict the fate of humanity with certainty. Only the Word of God gives us a clear picture of the future. While the world attempts to calculate its own destruction by human methods, God's true clock continues to tick toward the fulfillment of His promises. We do not know the exact day or hour, but prophetic signs indicate that we are closer than ever to the return of Christ. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 33, "So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, right at the doors." The expression "at the doors" is a metaphor indicating imminence. It means that when these signs are evident in the world, Christ's return will be about to happen. It does not mean that it will happen immediately, but that humanity will be in the end times. Christ is coming soon. It is time to prepare ourselves and guide our families on the path of truth. We cannot ignore the signs of the times, but we must be alert, strengthening our faith and living according to God's will. This brings us to the end of this video. We hope that the information shared has been of great help and has motivated you to reflect on the importance of being spiritually prepared. If this content has been a blessing to you, we invite you to continue delving deeper into the Word of God. See you in the next video. May God bless you.